Farmers know that countries like China have been really screwing them over for decades and messing with America. And they like seeing a posture that gets tougher. They like tougher negotiations. They like making sure that we're not letting that happen.
I am a husband, a father, a lawyer, a Christian, and a proud Canadian. I started this series because it was clear that our nation needs truth. Not just another biased narrative, but real information of substance. We need access to facts and the freedom to think for ourselves. I'm Leighton Gray, and this is Gray Matter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Gray Matter. Many people will not realize or know anything about something called the Belt and Road Initiative. This is China's plan to essentially acquire massive tracts of land all over the world for the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party. For example, in the United States right now, over 350,000 acres of arable farmland is owned by the Chinese. Not a single acre in China is owned by the United States. It's a serious problem. And to talk about it, and of course, this is not unique to the US, it's also true of Canada and other parts of the world. But to talk about today is our guest, Brian Reisinger. Welcome to the program, Brian. It's great to have you on. This is a very important topic that I don't think is discussed enough.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I think you're absolutely right. It's one of the many ways that farms disappearing in America, and something that's happened in a lot of countries, has a very serious impact not only on our food, but also national security and geopolitical issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've written a really interesting book about this. We're going to talk about that and some of these implications for North America and quote unquote the free world. But before we go there, as we always do, we're going to talk about our framing aphorisms. Of course, these are in honor of your book and the topic we're discussing. The first is from Xi Jinping, the dictator who runs China, who says the pursuit of the Belt and Road Initiative is not meant to reinvent the wheel. Rather, it aims to complement the development strategies of countries involved by leveraging their comparative strengths. Next, from a lady named Irina Bokova, who is the former Director General of UNESCO, which is one of the organizations which works as a front for China. She says, I see the Belt and Road Initiative and its focus on cultural exchanges as cooperation in education and sciences as a renewal of the Silk Road. Next, from the outgoing President of the United States, Joe Biden, in one of his more coherent moments, said, if we don't figure a way in which these countries can grow and participate and be able to build infrastructure, the Chinese have a Belt and Road Initiative. He says, well, the Belt and Road Initiative turns out to be a debt and confiscation program. And finally, from the incoming president, the president-elect Donald Trump, who says, we have lost thousands of factories since China opened up and joined the WTO. 70,000 factories we have lost. Can you believe it? It's hard to believe. I thought it was a typo. It is a greatest jobs theft in the history of the world. Who do we have in the show today? Well, Brian Reisinger, author of Land Rich, Cash Poor, My Family's Hope and the Untold Story of the Disappearing American Farmer. Grew up on a family farm in Sauk County, Wisconsin, and lives to tell the hidden stories of rural America. He's a columnist and a consultant. He worked with his father from the time he could walk before entering the worlds of business, journalism, and public policy. He has been published in USA Today, Newsweek, Yahoo News, the Milwaukee Journal, Sentinel, USA Today Network, and many others. And his writing has won awards from the National Society of Newspaper Columnists, first place in the Seven Hills Literary Contest, a Solus Award, and more. He lives with his wife and daughter and serves as president and chief content officer of Midwestern-based Platform Communications, splitting time between a small town in Northern California and the family farm in southern Wisconsin. Land Rich, Cash Poor is his first book, and it's an important one. So, Brian, let's start with this. It sounds as though in your family, you have a deep history, a culture of farming, of working the land. And of course, this is something that's very, very basic to North American life. We're the breadbasket, really, for the Western world. So maybe just for our viewers and listeners, I'd like to hear from you, just get a sense of why farming is so much a part of your family's history, and why you think it's so vital that we retain the history and the functional family farm.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that so much. My great grandparents came to America, um, escaping pre-World War One Europe. Rather than living in a war-torn country, they wanted to live in America and find a better life for themselves here in the North American continent. And so they began digging their living out of the dirt in the hills of southern Wisconsin. And we still have that land today. And my grandpa took it over, and then my grandpa and grandma, and then my mom and dad, and now my sister is working to take it over from my dad. So we're four generations deep here in terms of making our living as well as finding really our value on the land. And what I found as I was writing Land Rich Cash Poor, I wanted to answer the question, why are our family farms disappearing? And I knew it was something that our family had seen and experienced. I didn't know the answer to it. And so we really weave hidden areas of history that drive that disappearance with my family's story. And that really gets down to why this matters so much. It is a personal story for me, but it is an issue happening in a rural area that really affects our entire country and beyond. It affects
Hmm.
our food supply, price, health, and otherwise. It affects national security, all kinds of other issues. And so I think it's one of those things that is meaningful to me, having grown up where I did with the roots that I'm fortunate to have had. And what I discovered as we worked on this book is the fact that what's happened to us and other families like us on the ground has massive implications for people who've never set foot in a barn.
Hmm. Hmm. The late Henry Kissinger once was quoted as saying that he who controls the food supply controls the world. And I want to talk about this, and this ties in somewhat to the content of your book, although I don't want to understate your book or limit it to political issues. It's much broader than that. I realize the focus is, but talking about this political issue, this food supply is really crucial to this battle for world hegemony, isn't it, between communist China and the United States? You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it really is. And it's something that countries have recognized for a long time. And there's been a lot of political decisions made by great powers and large and small countries alike around how they're going to secure their food supply, how they're going to disrupt or supply the food supply of other countries. There's a lot of decisions that are made that affect all of us based on that. The situation that we're in now is one where a major foreign adversary, perhaps the most significant foreign adversary of communist China, is trying to get their hands on and to be able to hold captive on some level our food supply. It is not only the farmland they're buying up, but it is also where they're buying it up. They're buying it near military installations, which we shouldn't consider a coincidence. And now the overall amount of farmland owned by foreign countries is still relatively small in America. I want to be honest about that, but it is the rate of increase that has been so alarming to so many people. It increased by 15% in just 2 years recently. And there are different types of foreign investment from different countries. Some farms might decide that investment from a friendly foreign country can be helpful to their industry. Others would never dream of it. There's room for discussion on that. But the foreign adversary piece and the degree to which China has been able to get their hands on farmland is a very serious problem. And it is a consequence in part of our disappearing family farms, because as our land ends up in fewer hands, it is easier for the Chinese to be able to come in and make meaningful purchases of farmland. It's very hard to do with the traditional North American concept of many small landowners. And that's slipping away. And so this threat is growing.
Hmm. Xi Jinping and China talk about this thing called the Belt and Road Initiative. He says that, and I'm quoting him. He says China launched this BRI, we'll call it, to mobilize more resources, strengthen connectivity, leverage potential growth drivers, and connect markets. That all sounds good. He says it's designed to integrate more countries and regions into economic globalization and achieve shared prosperity through mutually beneficial cooperation. He says it embraces the historic trend of economic globalization, responds to the call for improving the global governance system, and addresses people's desire for a better life. That all sounds really rosy, but in boots on the ground, the Belt and Road Initiative doesn't really work that way, does it?
That's right. The American farmer, by the way, knows this instinctively, having worked to dig their living out of the ground and seen how China interacts with us. And I'll give you some examples. Going back a little earlier in history, in the 90s and the 2000s, the Chinese were buying a massive amount of agricultural products, and so farms and American industry was responding naturally to that and selling it. and it was, something that drove some prosperity. But then what we found is that throughout the 2000s, off and on, the Chinese, once they had captured so much of our agricultural goods, so much of our market, and had us depending on selling it to them, they would do irregular buying. They would suddenly stop buying, or they would change their behavior. And they are large enough, they can throw off world demand. They can affect our prices. So the Chinese have been capturing American agriculture and then dumping the prices down through the floor and really messing with the American farmer. When you combine that with all the ways that China has cheated on trade standards and all kinds of things with their currency and other things, farmers have known for a long time that we're getting screwed by China. And so the idea that we can just simply cooperate and not have to balance that with appropriate toughness is something that farmers know doesn't pass the smell test, so to speak.
Hmm.
That's what they'd say where I'm from.
And even if it were just China, that would be bad enough. But actually, one of the biggest enemies of farmers in countries like the United States and Canada is actually our own governments, isn't it? The governments are really working against you in many ways, and you talk about this in your book. Do you want to explain how the government of the United States and state governments are actually working against the ability of farmers to flourish and and thrive and be prosperous and do what they do, which is produce the food that feeds everybody?
Yeah. It's incredible to ponder because, any political leader will say that they support farmers, and they may well mean it. And some of these things may be intentional and some may be unintentional. We may not ever really be able to know completely. But the reality is that in America, we've lost 45,000 farms per year on average for a century.
Wow.
And that means that the establishment of both parties at different points in our history have all changed places and gone back and forth and made all kinds of mistakes. A really good example is the 1980s farm crisis that some folks might remember, when tens of thousands of farms were wiped out. Both political parties for decades by then had been encouraging farms to get bigger or get out, grow and take on more scale or get out of the business. And at some point, if you continue to do that, you are squeezing out farms because there are some farms that aren't going to be able to make it. One of the ways that they did that was by encouraging farmers to take out government backed debt. So this government fueled debt was being taken out in order to expand. And then not long after that, they raised the interest rate to try to deal with the issue of inflation, as they've been doing in more recent years.
Hmm.
And you can argue for or against both those decisions. You can argue for or against an effort to get farms to take out debt to be able to do more. You can argue for or against the adjustments around trying to address inflation. But when you do both of those things at one after the other without proper regard for the farmer, what you're doing is you're pushing debt on them, and then you're making that debt more expensive. And that is one of the things, not the only, but one of the things that triggered this massive farm crisis, where we lost tens of thousands of family farms for no reason other than the foolishness of our government.
Hmm. And so, what you say needs to happen is our governments need to work cooperative with, or work in a way that's collaborative with farmers, so that the families like yours can continue to stay on the land and work the land and do what they've always done, and that is to create essentially food independence for countries like the United States and Canada. Like that's the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we see is that we share so much on this continent in terms of some of the challenges and forces that farmers on the ground in Canada and in America face. And each year it gets harder and harder to grind out a living.
Hmm.
And what we need to do is have a situation where our countries are securing our domestic food supply rather than wiping out thousands of farms a year, tens of thousands of farms a year in many of those years, and at the same time importing more food than we're exporting. We're basically wiping out our domestic food supply and saying we want to rely on foreign countries for our food to a much greater degree than I think is secure. And it goes back to
Hmm.
your central point of, do you have a food supply that you have control of? Because if you don't, someone else is controlling you.
This seems like a really obvious point, Brian. So, why? Who's not getting it? Why aren't governments, the domestic governments, that should be interested in food supply for Americans, for Canadians? Why are they not more focused upon making sure that conditions are right for farmers to flourish?
Well, I think in the case of political leaders, they've lost control of the situation. They were trying for the very long time to get as much food produced as possible, as cheaply as possible. And that's a good goal. But when it's the overriding thing and it's the only thing, what you end up doing is you end up wiping out farms of all kinds, of all sizes, and you end up crippling your food system. And we see that with our supply chain. COVID was the biggest example as industries were being shut down. we had a situation where you saw how fully integrated the food system is, where one big distribution center shuts down, and suddenly that means that the supply chain is locked up, and consumers can't get the food they need, or if they can, it's more expensive. And farmers can't sell their goods, and if they can, it's for a much lower price. So how do you have consumers paying more and farmers getting less? This is a really kind of dystopian situation. And I think our political leaders have just simply lost control of it. I think the average person out there knows there's something not right. They sense there's something wrong, and they know that our farms are not only farms to feed us, but they're a part of ourselves. They have a sense there's something wrong. But the reality is that our societies are just more removed from what's going on the farm. We used to have more
Hmm.
families around the farm, and as that happens, it's natural for people to not necessarily know and understand what's going on the farm and how that connects to the food on the shelf for them.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I was looking at a map recently of North America, and it was showing that basically the most small L liberal places are all big cities, and the conservatives all live in the country.
Mhm.
And I think this is fundamentally an important point because of what you just said. People who live in places like New York or Toronto or Los Angeles don't or have lost an understanding that all the things that they use every day, from food to energy to even things like water, electricity, it's all being produced in the country. uh, but they don't seem to have an understanding of this. So all the wokeness and all the people who buy into climate scam and are saying that, oh, we have to shut down farms to save the environment, they seem blissfully ignorant of the fact that everything that they're using every day in the city, when they go to plug in their razor or their coffee maker or whatever, all of that's being produced. Everything in their refrigerator, at least all the natural whole food, is all being produced in the country. This is a serious disconnection, isn't it, culturally? And it's impacting things quite a bit in countries like the United States and Canada.
It really is. Our most recent election, whatever one's voting preference was, our most recent election showed that there is more Republican and conservative support in rural areas and more urban and suburban support for Democrats than there's ever been. It's more concentrated in that way. And one of the things that happens is when a country is separated that way, we're not just separated based on the ideas that we have, but we're separated on who we are as people. It's one of those divisions
Hmm.
that's really hard, and it creates a lot of these disconnects. And so you have people who obviously they care about their food, obviously, but they don't connect it to how these other issues affect farmers. And so it keeps us from solving problems like keeping our food more affordable. It keeps us from solving problems like how to make sure that we have plentiful, healthy food and secure food. And it also impacts other issues. I always say to people who are maybe of one side of the political spectrum or another, this touches on national security, this touches on the environment. I mean, there are so many, for example, people who care about our environment and farmers have a lot of common ground on working together to try to find ways to have, for example, healthy soil, abundant clean water. These are things that farmers have an interest in and that people who care about our environment have an interest in, but they end up fighting over those or other issues rather than solving them together. There's a lot of problems we could solve if people who are of a bit different persuasions would understand what's driving them and work together with farmers or with whomever else that they may disagree.
Hmm. We have people, very very high level influential people in the United States, people like John Kerry, Bill Gates, and others connected to the World Economic Forum and the whole globalism movement, if we call it that whole political arena, are very much focused on destruction of farmers and ranchers. And it's all tied into the green climate. Well, Trump calls it the green climate scam, and I quite agree. How is the farmer, someone like you, working in the land in Wisconsin, how are you going to stand up to all of that? To Bill Gates, one of the richest men in the world, former vice presidents talking about how we have to get rid of farmland. We see what's happening over in Europe with in Holland, where farmers are under attack. It's happening here in Canada, where restriction of certain types of fertilizers. How's the sort of little guy, the farmer, going to stand up to all of this, Brian?
It's a great question, and I think about people like my dad owning the farm and my sister taking over the farm. As I write about these issues and explore these issues, I think a lot about our farm, and I think a lot about so many other farm families. And what I would say is that, you know, a lot of power is derived from the fact that so many of our farmers live in and drive major battleground states politically. So
Hmm.
Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, these are quote unquote blue wall states that have gone back and forth the last couple of elections and went convincingly for Republicans this time. And whether people like that or not, whether they are on the side that cheered that or whether they're on the side that didn't, understanding its importance and understanding that it was the rural vote that really drove that. The one consistent thing that you see across the states is that the rural vote went stronger for Republicans and for Donald Trump. And, suburban vote was stronger for Kamala Harris and the Democrats in some places, not in others. Hispanic and black vote grew for Trump in some places and not in others. But the rural vote expanded uniformly. And a lot of people didn't think that was possible. And so I think that my hope is that whatever someone's political persuasion is, they will understand that the rural vote is a crucial voting block in the most crucial battleground states. And that if we want people to uh, not be as economically frustrated, if we want people to work with us on solutions, whatever the case may be, they need to pay attention to what's going on in these battleground states and what's driving these battleground states, which is rural areas.
Folks, Brian's book is called Land Rich, Cash Poor: My Family's Hope and the Untold Story of the Disappearing American Farmer. A very fascinating book, unlike, frankly, anything I've read, and really highlights a very important demographic, if we can call it that, and maybe that's to understate it, and its importance really to every aspect of our lives. But one group you were talking about just now, Brian, you're talking about rural people. One group you focused on is the Amish. Do you want to talk about that a little bit and how they factor into your book and your writing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I grew up in an area where there's a lot of small farmers that are maybe kindred spirits a little bit with the Amish. We live in an area where there are Amish folks living not far away up in the hills, and we've done business with them. We've gotten to know them, and they are also prominent in states like Pennsylvania. And one of the things that I think was one of the really interesting and notable kind of things that shocked a lot of people is that there were tens of thousands, and in some estimates more, Amish voters who turned out in Pennsylvania and really ended up pushing the election in the
Hmm.
direction of the Republicans. And one of the reasons that they were animated is because there was a farm that had been raided by the government, and the Amish there felt that it was an unfair overreach and that this man who's trying to make a living is being stamped out by the government. And they made clear that they weren't going to stand for it. And the particulars of any case need to be weighed in their own merits, of course. But I think it just is another example of how the economic frustration that people in rural areas feel and the feeling that they have that our government ought to be working to help farmers be able to make it, not working against them, is a very powerful force
Hmm.
in America. And it's one that I don't think should be ignored or taken for granted by anybody.
Hmm. This is rather uncharacteristic for the Amish. They don't strike me as very, very political people. I must acknowledge, however, that my knowledge of the Amish is limited to a 1984 movie starring Harrison Ford called Witness. The
Yeah.
really good flick, by the way. Even though Harrison Ford is a terrible lib, as we know, he campaigned for Harris. But that is uncharacteristic for the Amish, isn't it? And it's kind of a good sign
Yeah.
that maybe some people, and this goes for let's say rank and file Christians as well. One of the problems with getting them out to vote is many people have this idea, if you're a person of faith, you're a Christian, that you should be apolitical. But that's a real problem in terms of getting those people out to vote. So it is a promising sign that the Amish are coming out and are seeing this impact them where they live and are being a force to be reckoned with politically, isn't it?
Well, and you're right that they have a culture where in many ways they've withdrawn from many of the things that are going on in society. And so they don't necessarily participate in all of the things that your average citizen might. And so for them to come out in this strong a fashion is definitely a shift. And I think it touches on something that is broader as well. It touches on just the broader frustration in rural America with the economic status quo that has been leaving them behind for a very long time. We've had farms disappearing now for more than a century, and we've had, as a result, the small and rural communities and small towns in this country that were built by the farms have been shrinking. And so you have towns that lost their farms a century ago or decades ago, and you have towns that have been shrinking for decades. So that by the time we have more modern job loss of the Rust Belt jobs that everyone hears about, and by the time we have inflation that really drove a lot of what happened in the most recent election, people in rural areas have been living economic decline for decades. And so the level of frustration that they have when they feel that their political leaders aren't hearing them is very intense. And I think
Hmm.
that's something that was observed. And, I tell people that, Republicans need to make sure they understand that so that they don't just assume that rural areas are going conservative just because, and they need to understand why that is. And they need to be building policies around trying to help solve problems that took decades to become entrenched and are going to take a long time to solve. And people who are unhappy that rural areas went for Republicans need to understand that it's not because of any of these other distracting issues. It's because of the real economic reality that people are living in rural areas.
Hmm. One of the distinctive features about North America, and let's use the United States maybe as a prime example, is leaving aside, the leftist idea that everyone here we're all imperial, colonists. There's something very, very deep in the American culture about the connection with the land and the independence of the person who's a farmer or a rancher. I mean, this is. I mean, almost every plot of every Western movie is about this. Take Shane, for example.
Mhm.
It's about this, but the independence of the American farmer has been very much under attack by government policy, by bureaucracy. For example, I was reading recently that um, the U.S. government has been over many decades now has been incentivizing the growth of certain crops like corn and soy because these are ubiquitous things that are in almost every type of processed food. And so this has been whittling away, tearing away at the independence of the American farmer. So if you don't farm a crop like soy or corn, basically you can't function, you can't thrive because basically you're beholden to government. This seems rather un-American, doesn't it?
Well, and the subsidies that drive that, they aren't enough to make it a prosperous living that keeps us from having our farms disappear. It's not as if it's working in terms of keeping our farms from disappearing at the clip of 45,000 a year now.
Hmm.
So it's not addressing that issue. And so what it is doing is it's locking many farms into growing just those crops and products. And I grew up on a farm that grows corn and soybeans, and we also grow other types of crops, and we're experimenting, with more types of crops now as we try to figure out the right path forward for our farm. And the reality is that there are so many farms that grow those crops and products, and they have a place to take that to market. But if they tried to grow some sort of specialty food product, they don't have a place to take it. There isn't a market infrastructure built around it. And that's part of the reason for that is because the subsidies have steered our farming so strongly in a few specific directions that there isn't a lot of industry out there buying and selling other types of crops from our farmers incredibly, at a time when consumers want to know more about where the food is coming from and want to have more variety and more fresh local options and more specialty foods than ever. And I think that's part of the reason that it can change. But you're absolutely right that, at the end of the day, a lot of people, both inside and outside of farming, have things they don't like about our government programs. And, I think the reason that that has happened, there's a lot of them, but one of the reasons is because continually there's just a piling of additional government programs one on top of the other. And there isn't a lot of assessment of, is this working? Isn't it? Let's deeply reform it. If it's not, it's usually just kind of band-aids and piled on top of one another. And so whether one program is functioning the way it ought to or not is not something that we can discern. And well, we know that they're not, I should say, but it's not something that can be examined to be figured out because of how contradictory and how compounding all these programs are. And then, at the end of the day, over time, government programs are prone to abuse and favoritism.
Hmm.
And so even if they were doing what they're supposed to do originally, they may not be anymore. And so many of them are piled on top of one another that we really can't tell what's going on. And so it's a mess that is really means that there's a lot of money being spent on farms without necessarily the farmers being helped in the way that
Hmm.
they need. And so it's both true that we have farms suffering and money being wasted.
Hmm. We have a similar problem in Canada with dairy. Of course, Wisconsin is very well known for dairy, especially cheese. Not to make it sound like a cliche, but let's face it, Wisconsin cheese, the cheeseheads.
Proudly.
Um, but in Canada, we have to spend a lot more for dairy, for everything from milk to cheese to butter, because there's a cartel that exists in the province of Quebec, and everyone in the country is beholden to it. We have to buy products that are produced, dairy products produced in Quebec. They get political incentives, and so we pay more than Americans do, because of that. Do you have similar problems like that in the United States in terms of dairy and cartels controlling price?
Yeah, there's always a lot of debate and discussion over whether to move toward, the model that you have in Canada. And one of the reasons that has been keeping that from happening is the higher prices for consumers. And another of the reasons is less freedom for farmers to make decisions around what they want to do in terms of when they're expanding their herd and what they're doing and that kind of thing. So we don't have that specific system, but we do still have many of the same problems. We have government programs that steer farmers in particular directions. We have government programs that make other things less viable than they would otherwise naturally be. And one thing I like to note for people too, and I think it's true of your good farmers in Canada as well, is that, you know, despite all of these things, it's not necessarily the case that the farmers put more money in their pocket when the food prices are high either, because that food is bought and sold many times between the farm gate and the dinner table, and everybody's getting a cut. So by the time it gets back to the farmer, their share of that increase isn't all that large. And by the way, their prices are increasing too. So when the cost of food or gas or what have you is going up for consumers, the farmer's facing the same crunch with seed, fertilizer, energy. And so the reality is that the farmer and the consumer, they're usually in the same situation together. They're usually facing the same kind of economic squeeze.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, our mothers always told us that we are what we eat, and this is very true. I mean, actually, Hippocrates said it a little bit differently. He said, "Let thy food be thy medicine, thy medicine be thy food." But it's true. We are what we eat, and we're finding out over the past couple generations that what we're eating is not all that good for us. In fact, I saw one statistic recently that as many as three-quarters of people in North America are considered obese. So we have this overweight epidemic, which seems to have come upon us quite suddenly, at least during my lifetime, but it has a lot to do with processed food. And we recently had a little thing in your country called the presidential election, and Mr. Trump has been filling out his cabinet positions, and he's put Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in charge of health. And of course, he is a severe critic of processed food, and he thinks that one of the keys to restoring the health of America, and including mental health, and you talk about this in your book, is seeing food as a way to restore the physical and mental health of Americans, to make the country stronger, and that farmers have a crucial role in that. Are you encouraged by what you're hearing so far from RFK Jr., and do you think that this government is going to be more beneficial, more cooperative with farmers than perhaps the Biden administration was?
Well, it's a very interesting time where we have people who care more about where their food comes from than ever before. And that is a huge opportunity for farms to be able to seize on that and to be able to say, we can meet that need. And I think that the reality is that this is a situation that, again, took decades to cause, and it will be a long road to come back. And we need change sustained over time. We need things that can help bring down the costs that farmers face as they're producing their goods. We also need policies that are going to create new entrepreneurial opportunities for our farmers. And so we need more innovation. We need research and development that is focused on what are those new frontiers of agriculture, the new crops that can be put in the ground that can supply the food of America in a new and innovative way. We haven't had major innovations in that in a long time, and many of the innovations that we've had in farming have left the small farms behind. They weren't technology that could be adopted by any farm of any size. And we need to have more of that. We need to have, efforts to make sure that our markets aren't anti-competitive, either internationally or domestically, that farmers get a fair shot to compete on a level playing field. And so there's a number of issues that we need to address. And I think that a number of the concerns and challenges that farm country is facing are things that the incoming administration focused on, and that's why they won. I do think it's a long-term thing, and I also do think it's a complicated picture, and there are ups
Mhm.
and downs to a wide variety of policies that affect farmers. Farmers throughout our history have been kind of caught in the middle of what's happening between the two parties, unfortunately.
But the reality is, right now, let's face it, MAGA, if we can call it that, is not an urban movement. The major cities in the United States and Canada, for that matter, are all liberal, and rather disconnected from life in the country. But it seems as though the people in the rural have spoken, and overwhelmingly they're rejecting a lot of the values that are coming out of places like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago, and
Yeah.
they're turning more towards getting back to, let's say, the originalism of America, which is fundamentally rural. It's country life, and it seems to me that given who the American people have elected, people in the rural are going to have a lot bigger say in what's happening politically. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, and they've spoken, and what they've said in part, I think, is that the economic fate of our country rests in rural America, and we need to address these issues. And
Hmm.
they've shown their deep level of frustration. They've shown that the status quo has been leaving them behind for far too long for them to not be listened to anymore. And so I think that it's a situation where, and particularly again, because what we were talking about with rural areas driving the vote in such key battleground states, we're in a position to have the country's attention and the attention of our leaders. And so I think that's something that farmers in rural areas can hopefully make the most of.
Hmm. Now, in terms of what, for example, RFK Jr. is talking about, and that is, let's call it a food revolution, changing the way Americans eat, getting back to um, eating more natural food, less highly processed food, even things like seed oils. How do you think those policies, if they find their way into law, are going to impact farmers in North America?
Yeah, there are real opportunities at this time, and what I always tell people is that the picture is complicated for farmers. And so if we have a world where our country is shifting toward more foods that can be produced naturally in the ground, and more food that can be bought locally and directly, and more food that is healthy, and farmers are in a position to capitalize on that entrepreneurial, that could be a huge opportunity. And right now we have, although we've lost 70% of our farms, we have nearly 2 million farms left. And there are 88% of those farms that are small farms.
Hmm.
And the way that those farms are able to survive, people are often surprised to hear that. The way they're able to survive is because they're not full time income. So you got people who are also working factory shifts or construction jobs or pouring concrete and running a farm. If those farms could be full time growing entrepreneurial ventures again, because they're supplying a more meaningful portion of our country's food, that is great opportunity for them.
Hmm.
The same thing, same time, what we do need to do is we need to make sure that we craft those policies in a way that understands and accounts for the fact that farmers are small businesses. So it takes money to invest in a new type of crop and to change your operation in that direction, and there's a risk to doing it. Farmers are ready and able to marshal their resources with care and live some of the riskiest lifestyles there are out there. And so farmers are ready to do that. We just need to make sure that farms as small businesses are able to make those transitions, so that the change doesn't end up wiping them out in terms of them taking on the cost of making the change and not being able to work through it in a natural transitional way that we would need any small business to be able to do. So there's
Hmm.
great opportunity, and we just need to make sure that we craft the policies in a way that understands the realities of being a little guy in a big economy.
Hmm. Hmm. Folks, we're talking with Brian Reisinger, who is the author of a new book called Land Rich, Cash Poor: My Family's Hope and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer. Brian, you're an award winning journalist. You've been published in really all the top publications and newspapers. What was the impetus for you to write this book? What was your inspiration?
Yeah, it was really with me from the beginning, I would say. You mentioned that I worked with my dad from the time I could walk. And ever since I could remember understanding words, I remember people talking about farms disappearing. And it was a situation where I knew I could hear people talking about farms going under, farms selling. And as a kid, I knew that was happening. I didn't know why it was happening. And as I grew older, I wanted to be able to answer that question. And so I went off into business journalism and public policy. And in the course of that, I saw the way that our economy was leaving families like mine behind. And I was lucky to have grown up with a good middle class living where my dad was able to help pay for college. I worked through it too. And I'm grateful for that, but we could see that it was slipping away.
Hmm.
And I wanted to answer that question. And so, in many ways, as I said, I've been carrying this story around pretty well from the beginning.
Hmm. One of the beautiful things about your book is you really tie a thread. You connect the American farm and its consequence, and really its quintessence in American history. You weave a tapestry there. The importance of the American farm, how it's always sort of been sort of almost the spine of America. You talk about going back to the Great Depression and things like that. Was that one of the things that you wanted to emphasize in the book so that people could see the historical importance of farming and why it's so vital going forward?
Yeah, it was. The way that I came about that though was a little bit of a discovery, I have to be honest, because it began with me wanting to tell my family's story. And I had
Mm,
the sense that, my grandparents surviving subsistence farming and poverty when they first got to America, my grandpa and grandma surviving the Great Depression, to climb into the middle class, my dad and mom surviving drought their first year of marriage, and then surviving the farm crisis, and then them along with me and my sister seeing what globalization and seeing what the recessions of the 2000s and COVID and all of these crises did to farming. I wanted to tell that story, and I wanted to share in an honest way the good and the bad, and the triumph and the struggle of that, because I thought it was important. But I had the sense that the experiences that we were living on the ground connected with bigger forces, and I didn't know what those forces were, and so that's what I set out to research. And I guess I have to be honest, it's maybe a little bit of dumb luck that our family's experience and the forces that were at play in each of these eras ended up really connecting very deeply. And I was
mhm,
shocked to learn, for instance, that the Great Depression, although it hit in 1929 for the whole country, it hit farm country a decade earlier.
mm,
And
yeah.
there are big global reasons for that. And it corresponded with the fact that my grandpa grew up in 2 decades of poverty before he finally climbed into the middle class, and we saw the human cost of that.
Mhm,
And so, being able to tell those personal stories of people being hurt in tragic farm accidents, facing weather that blesses or threatens, harrowing experiences of hardship, also, stories of beauty of what it is to live close to the land. To be able to tell those stories and to see how it aligns with and connects to all of these bigger forces is something that's been very meaningful to me. But I was also a little lucky that it took that form and that it turned out that way, to see that our family had really lived something that was emblematic of what was going on in the economy
mhm.
for a long time.
I got the sense from reading the story of your family also that one of the central forces that sort of bound the family together, brought it through all these hard times and good times, was your faith. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, we open the book talking about some of the beauty of the land and what it's like to live there. And you live close to the land, you're living very close to God's creation. And so, in the good times, you feel an appreciation that's very connected to your spirituality. And in the challenging times, you maybe turn to your faith pretty naturally. And
Mhm,
one of the things that we experienced, and we talked a lot about whether we wanted to share this, after we sold the cows, shortly after we sold the cows, our farm still operates. We raise heifers for other dairy herds. We raise beef for consumers, and we raise cash crops. But for more than 100 years, we had milk cows. And when we sold the milk herd in favor of diversifying the farm, although we had a lot of hope, and although it was a beautiful day, I was standing on the cabin porch with my dad. Uh, he was brought to tears, and there were storm clouds for him inside, because it's really akin to a death in the family when you sell the cows.
mhm,
And I remember wondering and worrying about the issue of farmer suicide, and that's something that many countries have dealt with. And farming is consistently one of the highest rates for suicide as far as occupations. And I remember wondering if my dad was feeling that way, and he told me and confessed to me in the course of writing the book and interviewing him that he had. Now, he came through that by focusing on his grandchildren and knowing that it would have been the wrong thing to do, and knowing that they needed him. And I'm so
mhm,
grateful that he did, and he's alive and well today. But I remember standing on that cabin porch and instinctively saying a prayer when I thought about that. And
mhm,
it's just a way that we grew up. And, there's times of beauty where you see it too. I mean, I remember as a kid, my dad bringing us down to the barn when there was a cow having a hard time delivering her calf, and we'd help deliver the calf, and we would watch it take its first breaths. And so you learn about the circle of life. So there's all these natural ways that you're living a very deeply dramatic human experience so close to God's creation that faith,
mhm,
I think, naturally winds through a lot of it.
mhm. And also family. I mean, we were talking about how the sort of the woke ideology really is very, very prevalent in urban centers. But whenever you talk about a farm, you're always intrinsically talking about a family. And so the many attacks on the family, we know what these are. Um, they're actually hitting farming communities even more so, even more acutely than other, perhaps other demographics. Would you agree with that?
Family is such a crucial part of our society, and particularly in rural areas, it's so valued. And when you grow up on a farm where, you know, you're growing up in a place that's not just your dad or mom's job, but it's your
Mhm.
home,
Right.
it's your community, it's your heritage, and family winds all throughout that. So it's incredibly important. And, I do think that people in rural areas value that. And it's also true that people in rural areas tend to have a little bit of, I don't want to speak for everybody, but they tend to have a little bit of a live and let live attitude, let me live my life kind of thing. There's an independence there. And so I think that people who live in rural areas tend to value family a lot, and they tend to value being able to make their own decisions about things pretty highly. And, that comes from, again, living close to the land. I always say that unique farmland spirit I was so lucky to grow up with. It's that individualism it takes to dig a living out of the dirt, and that sense of community it takes to come running when a neighbor's in need. And we've seen that over and over in our family's history.
Hmm. I realize that you're not an economist, but let's face it, the cost of groceries, of food, is a very, very major concern for people in the United States and Canada with inflation and things like that. Um, it doesn't seem as though the higher cost of food is benefiting farmers. Um,
Yeah.
is there a way to fix that going forward, to make sure that farms like yours can succeed financially and continue to produce good food for people, while also keeping grocery costs at the stores at a level that is manageable for everyday families? What are your thoughts about that?
It's a great question. I think there is. And I talked to a lot of economists as we were trying to figure out that deep problem of increasing food prices. And, having more ways for food to get from the farm gate to the dinner table is one way to do it. We have this
Mm.
large integrated system that, again, is vulnerable to disruption. Although in many ways it's a modern miracle getting all types of food to all parts of the country, it also has vulnerabilities. So having more ways that the food can get from the farm to the consumer directly through farmers markets, through grocery stores that carry local options, as many of them are willing to do if their customers ask and show the demand for it, through specialty food markets, all of these different routes. These are things that we can do. And what it takes people who care about where their food comes from asking for it, pushing for it, demanding it, so that not only we have more farmers markets, which are growing in all kinds of places, but we have more local options everywhere. We have food distributors and food processors and food retailers who are supporting that local and regional and fresh economy. And these are things that can be done if our government policies are realigned in some of the ways that we've been talking about, and if the American consumer makes clear what they want. Because I think if they do that, the
Mhm.
American farmer is ready to give it to them.
So, in that vein, and I may be oversimplifying this, correct me if I am, but if we start eating less processed food and more good, natural, whole food, like what you produce on your farm, is that going to be a net benefit to farmers in places like United States and Canada, in your view, or will that make a difference at all if people get back onto a more natural, whole food diet?
Yeah, I think it will be a benefit. It creates new entrepreneur opportunity for our farmers to meet, and it creates more choices for consumers. And that's something that, we have this world where people care about where their food comes from more than ever. And we have farmers who are struggling in many ways more than ever to be able to find a market for what it is that they're doing. And there's ways that we can make changes to solve this problem. And I think that discussing these issues is so important to be able to do that.
No, it's my pleasure to do this with you today and to talk about your book, Land Rich, Cash Poor: My Family's Hope and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer. One question I have, Brian, and this may be outside of your area of expertise, but Mr. Trump has been talking a lot about tariffs and how tariffs can be beneficial for America, in terms of reducing costs for Americans and actually really benefiting the U.S. economy. How do you think those tariffs, if Mr. Trump and his administration proceed with that, are going to impact food production in the United States in a
Yeah.
good way or a bad way, or both?
It's a great question, and it's something that I think we have to be blunt about. There are elements of this that farmers are very enthusiastic about and want to see, and then there are parts of this where it's a complicated picture for farmers. And I think talking about it helps us make sure that we craft our policies in the right way. Farmers know that countries like China have been really screwing them over for decades and messing with America, and they like seeing a posture that gets tougher. They like tougher negotiations. They like making sure that we're not letting that happen. And so, in that way, the tougher stance on China and the use of tariffs as a negotiating tool, I think, is something that a lot of farmers have cheered in the past and will continue to cheer. They also can be affected if the situation spins out into a scenario where there are tariffs being raised all across the globe in all kinds of different directions. Because what happens is tariffs then get slapped on American farm goods that are getting sold into other countries. There's a certain amount of food that's produced that is excess and needs to be sold somewhere. And so when those tariffs get slapped on American goods in foreign countries, that makes them more expensive, and it makes it so that farmers are not able to sell as many of their
Hmm.
goods. And
I
so if
see.
we can find a way to get tougher with China and other adversaries and make sure that the American farmer and the American worker and the American economy are being treated fairly, and do that in a way that doesn't put farmers in a position where their ability to sell their goods goes down into the basement, then we'll be able to handle this right. Farmers are very much behind getting tougher, and they just
Mhm.
live an economic reality on the ground that I think we have to bear in mind as we work through these policies and how they're formed.
Folks, we've been talking with Brian Reisinger. He's a journalist, a farmer, family farmer, and an author. And so we're going to turn to our reading list here, and we're going to add, of course, his book is featured today. It's added to our reading list. It's called Land Rich, Cash Poor: My Family's Hope, The Untold Story of the Disappearing American Farmer. And it's been described by Associated Press Book Review as an anthem to the family farmer in America. And that seems to me have got a fairly apt description of it, although it maybe understates the case. But the description of the book is that it weaves forgotten eras of history with the fourth generation fight for survival of the author's family in Midwestern farm country. And we learn about America's most detrimental and unexplained socioeconomic crisis, and that is how our family farms went from cutting a middle class path through the Great Depression to barely making ends meet in modern America. And along the way, we see the working class grit it takes to survive life on the farm and feed Americans. Accidents that kill or maim, weather that blesses or threatens, resilience against crushing economic crises from depressions and recessions to COVID 19, and the tradition that presses down each generation, where you're not just fighting for your job, you're fighting for your heritage. And so it's been our pleasure to have the author on the show today to talk about this and other things. One other book that we're going to add to our reading list that's somewhat related in terms of being a challenge to the American farmer is a book called Belt and Road: A Chinese World Order. Book was published 4 years ago by Bruno Macias, and this book describes how China's Belt and Road strategy is acknowledged to be the most ambitious geopolitical initiative of the age, covering almost 70 countries by land and sea, including the United States and Canada. It will affect every element of global society, from shipping to agriculture, digital economy to tourism, politics to culture. And most importantly, it symbolizes a new phase in China's ambitions as a superpower, and that is to remake the world economy and crown Beijing as the new center of capitalism and globalization. And so the author traces this extraordinary initiative's history, highlighting its achievements to date and its staggering complexity, which you've heard about a little bit today from our guest. And here he also asks whether Belt and Road is about more than power, projection, and profit. Might it herald a new set of universal political values to rival those of the West? And of course, I think we all know that. I think the answer is almost rhetorical. There's no question that Belt and Road is an attack on U.S. hegemony, and therefore, really everything that we want to preserve that's great about the West. So, Brian, we've added your book to our reading list. I'm interested to know whether there are other resources, websites, or other books that have influenced you that would also give our readers and listeners a better understanding of this topic and other things that you write about.
Hmm. Well, there are so many good books out there. one of the books that I think is really important is a book called 40 Acres Deep, and it's a novel, it's a novella about farmer mental health and talking about the struggle that farmers are living on the ground. And I think that's a really, really valuable one. Another on a nonfiction front is I really love the Teddy Roosevelt biography
Mm.
that came out. There's a series of them, and one of them is about his ascent to the presidency, and I think his story just traces so clearly American exceptionalism, and it's a book that weaves great areas of history with one man's journey, and I really enjoy that one too.
Mhm.
So I
Teddy
appreciate the.
Roosevelt, yeah, Teddy Roosevelt really is maybe the best comparison to Donald Trump, isn't he? I mean, in terms of his famous the assassination attempt on him, somewhat although he was injured more severely than Donald Trump, but really in terms of a larger than life figure, there are a lot of comparisons between Teddy Roosevelt and Trump, aren't there?
Well, they're both people who didn't fit into the boxes necessarily that our political system might have drawn for them. Interestingly enough, Teddy Roosevelt's assassination attempt, that you're referring to, where he was shot, as you know, and the bullet was lodged there, and there were some papers and other things that got in the way, but he finished his speech. That was done no otherwhere than Milwaukee, Wisconsin, not far from where I grew up. So there's a little history for you.
Incredible. Well, Brian, I want to thank you so much for being our special guest here today, and for your book. I enjoyed reading it very much. I strongly recommend it, folks. It's called "Land Rich, Cash Poor: My Family's Hope and the Untold History of the Disappearing American Farmer." I've enjoyed very much discussing your book with you. We wish you much continued success with it and with everything you're doing, especially your family farm. May it continue on for many generations.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all of that. Landridge Cash Bar is available on Amazon, anywhere people buy books online, but also bookstores nationwide, and they have it or they can get it for you. And I just hope anybody who picks it up or hears this just thinks about these issues and keeps the conversation going, because I think we
Yeah.
can do a lot about it if we do that. So thank you for the
Yeah.
opportunity.
Thanks, Brian.